Now, if you are like me, then you order your bass crunchy, fat, thick, and heavy. If you're not like me, then, well, let's face it, you should be. So for all the losers out there that like their basses thin, tiny, and weak, this is not the tutorial for you. But if you are a Chad, if you are an absolute unit and you like your basses thick, juicy, and heavy like me, then this is the tutorial where I'm going to teach you how you can achieve it. I present to you my own personal heavy bass effect rack. Now, just to show you an example of what this rack can actually do, let me give you a before and after of a couple of sounds here. This is the first one I have, which is a preset from Ghosthack's NextGen presets for Serum package. But when I run this guy through the heavy bass rack, not changing the volume at all, we get this. As another example, here's a sound from Essential Presets for Serum Volume 2 from Ghosthack, and it sounds like this. And now, not changing the volume at all, we run it through the heavy bass effect rack. And not only do these basses sound louder in your headphones, even though the volume actually hasn't changed as far as decibels, but it also sounds more broad and open in the frequency spectrum, which is very important. So now I'm going to take you under the hood with this rack. I'm going to show you why I picked the plugins that I picked, show you all the exact settings that I have set up here, and I'm going to explain my process for affecting sounds like these. So here we go. This is the rack we're looking at here. Surprisingly small, like there isn't as many things here as you might think there would be. So I'm just going to start with all of these turned off, and then we're going to kind of work our way through. So we'll just use this sound as an example. I kind of chose this because it was a sound that had a lot of dynamics, and it also, needed a little bit more richness and sizzliness in the high end. It overall just needed to be a lot stronger than what it was in order to sound good. Now keep in mind, there is a multi-band compressor already in this. And if we were to take that out, and we needed a little more of that, and I did add plenty of multi-band compression in this rack right here, but we did other things too, because other things are very important. So the first step is to add some multi-band compression with Maximus, at least for me. I like to use Maximus because you can kind of draw these shapes and curves however you want. You don't have to just twist knobs. You can actually get in here and create some shapes. Now, I don't recommend creating like super messy shapes like that. I recommend, doing smooth stuff, kind of like what I'm doing here. But basically, I crammed the low frequencies pretty dang hard because I want to just make sure that this region was generally consistent. So I crammed that up a lot. I also have the mid frequencies going here. And I just brought this line up. This is just turning up the gain pretty much. I just wanted these mid frequencies to be a little bit louder. I wanted them to retain dynamics. I didn't want them to get crushed too hard because the mid frequencies are very important. And now we have the high frequencies, which I added a little bit of a curve to, so there's a little less dynamics than there were before. But honestly, this is just bringing up the high frequencies a lot, because there were high frequencies that really need to be brought up. This wasn't a super high frequency sound to begin with. But after that, it just runs through the master. And since we're not going above about this level, there's really no need for anything to happen here. I just didn't change any settings. After that, we have an OTT where we're just crushing things through. And this will really flatten out that curve, as OTT always does. It will really crush the sound down and make it sound very flat, which in this case the sound pretty much needed. I did bring the time down a little bit, and the depth is not up all the way, but it's still a generally strong OTT that we have going here. So that would be the first thing that I think about when I'm making a heavy bass effect rack, is I want to think about compression. Now, usually the next thing that I would think about after that would be more like EQing, because I want to kind of dissect the sound and figure out what frequencies are annoying, what frequencies I want to boost, what frequencies I want to roll off. I'd really get in surgically with the EQ, but there's something a little different I want to add in this effect rack, which is a VOCODEX. And the reason I'm adding a VOCODEX is because VOCODEX is a vocoder that allows you to make sounds that don't necessarily sound like they're vocoded. And take this for example, when we turn on the vocoder, we're not really getting that classic weird, like, even though that does sound pretty cool, that classic sort of vocoder sound where it sounds all separated and thin and gurgly. We really didn't have that. We have it all the way up to make it sound nice and thick and rich. This is what I like VOCODEX for. And the key to this, first off, as I usually do with my basses, is just to roll off the very low end a little bit here. And this is the band gain multiplier. And this is essentially kind of like an EQ. It's just taking each band and showing how much the band should gain in volume. So these low bands that get kind of messy right here in the VOCODEX, I tend to lower them down in volume a little bit, just roll them off. Because if you're not careful, the low end and mid to low end can get really messy with VOCODEX. Make sure, you have your settings right, or you have the right kind of sound running through it. I only have the order on 1. You could think about this order as almost like a dry wet. I just have the order on 1 to not overpower it, and the bands are generally low. And I'd say the most important part of this for me is that a low number of bands and a high bandwidth is going to be crucial. Now, I actually already made a little tutorial about VOCODEX on our channel before. You can go search that up on our channel if you want to know a little bit more about this plugin. So I'm not going to explain too much of the technicalities, but basically I want to have a high bandwidth so all of the bands open up to receive all of the frequencies. And it's especially good when they overlap. You see how there are certain frequencies in the middle that aren't getting grabbed here? Those blank areas. They're very thin right now, but if I make them thicker, we get stuff like that, and then they start to overlap. And when they overlap a lot, it starts to sound nice and thick. And also I have this modular bandwidth all the way to the right here to just make it as thick as possible. Doing that can make it a little bit thin, so I make it nice and thick. I turn this all the way up, this modular pitch shift all the way up, so we get some nice high frequencies. And then I have the voices, this modular unison, up as high as it can go. Next up, I turned it from peak to RMS. So RMS is just a little bit slower than peak. And then I turned the time variables all the way down and kept it on minimum times. So that means there isn't going to be too much decaying of the vocoder effect. And that's pretty much it. And again, I could go into depth onto how VOCODEX does what it does and why, but I have a basic VOCODEX tutorial on the channel, like I said before. You can go check that out if you're interested. But if we listen to the sound, the problems that I'm hearing most are kind of in the mid to low regions. And these are problems that I actually find in the vast majority of basses that I run through this chain. So I go ahead and have an EQ on it right here where I'm really controlling these low mid frequencies. I'm making sure they don't get too out of hand. They were just whipping around a little too much for me. It wasn't very pleasant. And then I just kind of shaped the high and low frequencies to look like this. You can generally see what this EQ is doing. It's not too complicated. I just found some annoying spots in the low mid regions and brought them down. And that's really straightforward. And that goes right into this EQing aspect that I like to think about when I'm affecting these basses is after compression comes EQing with an optional VOCODEX in my case. And then after EQing comes the third bit here, which is basically distortion, just different kinds of distortion. And there's a lot of different ways you can distort. There's a lot of different plugins you can use to distort. Some people, if say you're using Ableton, will use Overdrive and Ableton Saturator, and those work very well. For me, I like to use two plugins. I like to use Fruity Soft Clipper and Fruity WAVESHAPER. Now you may say, well, what are you talking about? You have a WAVESHAPER right here, but this is a patcher. That's because this patcher contains actually 6 different soft clippers. Basically, the soft clipper is saturation. That's pretty much what it is. It's saturation. And then the WAVESHAPER is going to give us a little more direct distortion to cover this last kind of distortion step of the process. But right now, what I have done is actually multi-band saturation. And I have talked about this in previous videos, but basically this is what I like to do. I like to add this on anything I want to make louder. I have 3 separate channels here that are going in patcher. I separated it out 3 ways. And what these Maximuses are doing are separating them out based on frequency. Like take this for example. This is just the high end. And then this one turned on is just the mid region. And this one is just the low region. I've essentially gone into Maximus and just soloed the high and then soloed the mid right here and then soloed the low. So we have it split up, and each one of these, this high, mid, and low band separation is going through this soft clipper right here. It's this shape. You can see where the knobs are. This is one of the most basic plugins in FL Studio. You can see where the knobs are. It just goes through this, and it goes through it 2 times each. So there's 6 soft clippers going through all this. And what this does is this makes it louder without actually making it sound too distorted. This is why I really like it. Like take, for example, this is how it was before this patcher, and this is after. Now it turns out this does make it louder, but if you level them out together, you will see that the second, soft clipped version does sound louder, even if it is the same volume. But that's the problem here, is that it's now going over 0 dB. And I don't want that. I could use a limiter, sure, that would 100% work, but what I want to do here is actually use a WAVESHAPER. Now what this WAVESHAPER is going to do is it's similar to Maximus's modules in the sense that you can just kind of draw your own thing, but I don't tend to draw my own thing too much because I can get kind of chaotic. Basically, any frequency that goes over this point right here, over this top line, 0 dB, because this is like a negative infinity to 0 chart, low volume, high volume. If any volume goes over this ceiling right here, then it will get hard clipped at the end. And I also set just a little line at the top right here to hard clip even further. Now, if I hit it very quickly, you can spot a line. Just like that, just a little dash. And that line represents the volume. See, right now it went from 0 all the way up to that volume. When I hold this down, you don't see a line until it starts disappearing, just like that. Because the line is actually way up here, right? Because that's where the sound would be hitting loudness wise. But this plugin chops it off right at the top. It basically clips anything that's going over 0 dB. So we can go ahead and just play stuff above 0 dB. And we know that there will be just a little bit of distortion keeping that back, and it will never go over. And that is essentially my process for creating the fat rack. Just to kind of recap, what I did was I did multi-band compression with the Maximus and the OTT. I used VOCODEX to kind of thicken it up and glue the sound together, make it kind of interesting. I EQ'd it, and then I ran it through some slight distortion. And all of this together thickens up the sound, broadens it out, makes it heavier, makes it louder, makes it more powerful, all the stuff that you want when you're working with a heavy bass. Now I will say, just a little disclaimer, that this rack doesn't work on every sound, right? There are plenty of times when I've created a bass in Serum or something like that and tried running it through this rack and it didn't end up sounding good. Well, if it doesn't end up sounding good on your sound, it's not good. A lot of effect chains really do depend on the specific sound you're working with. They will require different EQs. They will require different amounts of compression and saturation, all kinds of stuff like that. They would require different settings on VOCODEX. And it might require some other plugins too. Like maybe you want to add some plugin that would allow for more stereo dimension. And you can make the stereo a little bit wider. If you're working with a very mono sound, then that might be a good option. It just really depends. But I will say, even if the sound doesn't work with this effect chain immediately, many times I have loaded up this effect chain as kind of a template to start working on my post-processing, because it has everything kind of laid out in front of me. I have the multi-band compression, I have the VOCODEX, I have the EQ, the saturation. It's all there, and I can kind of customize it to fit the sound that I'm working on. So even if it's not perfect, by God, it comes in handy. If you want to see more music production tutorials, you can click the subscribe button down below. We're coming out with these every week, and we are not stopping anytime soon. So may your basses be thick and may your drops be sick. Happy producing.